Read this book because it's both the best book on America, and you cannot understand the Western world today unless you understand America. The reason that Tocqueville is such an important author is because he's not just concerned with describing the features of government. He's talking about the quality of soul.
Welcome back. We have Ben Crocker with us today. Ben is University Dean at the University of Austin. He was formerly a Ramsey Center for Western Civilization postgraduate scholar in Washington, D.C. Ben is an alumnus of the Graduate Institute at St. John's College. He's also studied at the University of Southern Queensland and Griffith University, Queensland Conservatorium of Music. He writes in The Spectator, Quadrant, The Federalist, and his own publication called Crocker's Columns on literature, music, politics, and everything in between. So I would encourage you to check that out. But please welcome him to the front.
Well, thank you, Bree. I should correct one thing Bree said. Don't check out Crocker's Columns straight away because I haven't had a chance to update it for the past 6 months. So you might be reading some dated things, but I'm jesting. By all means, go and poke around and check it out. I think Bree's covered most of the basic facts in her introduction, but essentially what you should know about me is I'm a teacher. I grew up in North Queensland. I went to college in Brisbane, eventually made my way to Sydney, and I taught K through 12 for the better part of a decade. So everything from third grade music all the way up to seniors, and then I eventually did some adjuncting at the University of Sydney as well, mainly teaching music, but I also worked as a boarding house master in Sydney at the King's School, and so I have a real interest in the whole formation of young people. So when Bree and Scott asked me if I'd come and speak to you all, that was a very attractive proposition because as young Australians interested in doing something to better your country, your cause is something I'd really like to contribute to. So what I thought I would start by doing is, because this will really help me to just tailor what I'm going to say, not that I'm going to change anything fundamental. I want to know who I'm speaking to so I can really pitch what I'm saying at where you are. So can we just go around the room and just shout out where you're from, what your background is, and what your ambition in being here is. And take no more than 15 seconds. Film crew, we can cut this bit out. Okay, let me ask a couple of questions. Firstly, have you had a chance to read the short excerpt that I gave you? Don't read it all of a sudden. It's pretty short, but it's very, very deep. I'm not saying it's very difficult to read, but it is very deep. There's a lot in there. So what I might suggest is just glance down at some of the language, because the way I'm going to talk through the talk today is going to basically explain a lot of what's in there. But I really think you can sit with a text like this, even this short excerpt, for the rest of your life. A great author should be able to do that for you. You should find layers and layers and layers. Last question before I launch into things. Why do we read books? Let me give you my answer. We read books because they are the largest, most complex, self-contained way that the human race has managed to exhaustively explore ideas. Okay? A website cannot really do what a book does. Talking, although speech is possibly the foundation of books themselves, speech itself cannot really contemplate in the way that a book can talk in on itself and can exhaustively explore ideas. In the last session that I had the privilege of sitting in on, we talked a little bit about the pitfalls of the modern education system. Forget all of the ideological contamination, one of the tragedies of modern education is that we don't read full books anymore. And this is the same whether you're at the University of Sydney whether you're at Oxford or whether you're at Harvard. We read less and less full books. And so we are naturally deprived of that exhaustive working out of ideas. So the first thing I want to tell you and encourage you to do, if you're a young Australian interested in contributing to the health of the polity, and that's what we're all concerned with here, is read full books. Don't be content with going to university and getting your essay lists and cutting and pasting sources together and reading little excerpts. When you read Plato, when you read Aristotle, when you read de Tocqueville, you're dealing with authors of an altogether different disposition. And it's important that you read the whole book to understand exhaustively the ideas. And if you can do that, then you're already a long way to debunking a lot of the toxic ideology that you see in the education system. Because it's when we cherry pick, or when we, more importantly, allow other people to cherry pick and use our ideas against us, that they can be weaponized and they can be distorted. So read full books. In particular, today, although I'm not saying this is the only book to read this book because it's both the best book on America, and you cannot understand the Western world today unless you understand America. And it's also the best book on democracy. And when I say democracy today in the context of this speech, I'm talking about modern democracy. And I'm talking about democracy in the broadest possible sense. The reason that Tocqueville is such an important author is because he's not just concerned with describing the features of government. He's talking about, and this goes to the very deliberately chosen title of the talk today, he's talking about the quality of soul that people will have under democratic conditions, modern democratic conditions. You need to read this book because it helps describe who you are as an individual and who we are as a society under this thing that we call modern democracy, which is similar in some ways to ancient democracy, which you touched on in the last presentation, but it has some features which are altogether new, as the excerpt will show you, and some features that can actually be really troubling. Political discourse today encourages an idolized, I might say, idolatry kind of toward the very idea of democracy, that this is just simply an unquestioned good, and because it's democracy, that's what we've got to fight to protect, and we can't go wrong if we have it. And that in itself might be a problem. Okay, so there's a little way of introduction to what we're going to talk about today. Any problems understanding these terms? What is democracy? What is aristocracy? And what is modernity? When I'm talking about modernity, I'm not talking about the 20th century. I'm actually talking about the period from about the early 17th century onwards. We could go even a little bit further back. Okay? Before that, we have the Middle Ages, and before that, we have antiquity, which you touched on in the last talk. Okay, so antiquity, Middle Ages, but what we're going to focus on here is modernity in the broadest sense. And why is it a warning to modernity? Well, it's a warning to modernity because there are certain conditions in modernity which very bright minds predicted would cause some of the chaos that we see in the world today, even with this great thing that we call democracy. Okay? 2 weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C. With some of my fellow Australians, my friend and your incoming chief economist here at the IPA, Adam Crichton, and I went to a gathering of Australians in DC celebrating President Trump's inauguration. And there were two very prominent emotions in the room. One of them was exactly what all the Americans were feeling, which was this elation that finally we might be at a real inflection point in this 100-year reign, this 100-year march of progressivism through the institutions. There is a real optimism that this is actually the time. Not Ronald Reagan, maybe that quite wasn't it. Not Nixon, but maybe Trump is the blunt enough object that we need to finally make a dent in progressivism. So that's the first thing we felt, was optimism. The second thing we felt was jealousy. Because only in America do we have today the political conditions, not the need, but I'm just talking about the raw political conditions where we can actually have this attack on progressivism. Britain is a basket case. Ireland, if we talk about just the English-speaking world, Ireland has a problem all of its own. Canada has a problem all of its own. New Zealand has a problem all of its own. I love Australia, but we don't have the same political conditions here right now to actually make the change. So we were jealous of these things. And we're probably a little bit jealous that we are not quite ready, seemingly, to deal with this problem of progressivism in modernity. What happens to government under that rule? Okay, so what is this new thing that Tocqueville is trying to define? On January 20, when at his inauguration President Trump declared America liberated, he was not speaking metaphorically. The oppression that Americans endured during the Biden years was real. Enemies of the regime were silenced. Economic opportunity was denied to particular citizens with particular characteristics. Religious tolerance was utterly destroyed. And everyday people's liberties were curtailed at the behest of an oppressive central government. I would say that government was also marked by another characteristic, which was incompetence. But incompetence was not the point. Cruelty was the point. Oppression was the point. Incompetence was a second characteristic of the Biden regime. We must acknowledge, though, that the tyranny Trump rode in to save us from was not the same as that found in bygone eras. Rather, it's a kind of aggregated, mild oppression that itself is only made possible by the ascendancy of a modern democratic society, where the ruling power is dispersed across a variety of offices and agencies. The great Alexis de Tocqueville says to us that the kind of oppression with which democratic peoples are threatened will resemble nothing that has preceded it in the world. Tocqueville seems then to search in futility for a way to define the new species of oppression which will come to threaten us in modern times. What I think Tocqueville is recognizing is that at the dawn of the modern democratic age, and he's writing this in the early 19th century as he's traveling through America observing this spreading democracy for the first time. At the dawn of the modern democratic age, the spiritual, let me say that, emphasize that again for effect, the spiritual impulse that drives man to tyranny could not be restrained by new and ingenious systems, and nor could it be extinguished from the hearts of rulers. So the first lesson that we need to draw from Tocqueville is that when we survey all of human history, while our outward political systems may have evolved to appear more fair and more just, the way we like to praise democracy without criticism, our inward capacity to both inflict and to suffer tyranny has remained fundamentally unchanged. Now, while Tocqueville puts the idea of a permanent susceptibility to political wickedness in a refreshed and searching way, it's by no means his maxim alone. The American founders, when they drafted their constitution, essentially accounted for this fact when they designed their republic explicitly for flawed men. Further, any rudimentary understanding of Christian theology also accounts for our inherent fallenness as human beings. Both true Christians and true constitutionalists, and usually they are coincident in the same people, believe fundamentally that all human political systems remain inescapably corruptible. Now, awareness of that corruptibility is the first step that you as a young, politically motivated person must take in avoiding the seductive glare of liberal utopias. In modernity, however seemingly bright our outward political fixtures, be warned that no part of the inward instinct for tyrannical rule has been dimmed. The spiritual fires of despotism are as alive now as they ever have been. And this brings us to the second great insight that Tocqueville brings us. That as we're going through this seismic shift from aristocratic into democratic species of governance, those tyrannical spirits, if we agree that they're not going anywhere, right? Well, they're going to exist. Where do they go? Okay, and I'm talking at a level above the policy field here. Or we could say deeper than policy. What happens? Wherever they go, I think one of the biggest problems we have in modernity is that we don't actually fundamentally know how to understand how tyranny, how oppression is going to influence us and how it's going to manifest. When Tocqueville writes that he seeks in vain for a way to describe the oppression that will rise in the democratic age, he's grappling with the same basic frustrations of an ordinary American suffering under the Biden administration, or perhaps those of an earnest Victorian contemplating how to accurately describe the Andrews-Allen government. Ordinary non-political Australians, like ordinary non-political Americans, know that there is something deeply unjust and intrusive about the general conduct of these governments. Many, though, are unable to express the nature of that injustice or explain with clarity the depth of intrusion into their lives. This is the point. I think this is because, and I think Tocqueville thinks this is because, our modern sensibilities haven't surpassed our ancient hardwired expectations. We believe that we will see tyranny when it arrives because the kind of oppression we've become accustomed to over millennia of storytelling and lived experience is brazen. It's obvious. We had Thucydides mentioned in the first talk. When Thucydides' Athenians invaded Milos, they felt no need to disguise their brutality. They spoke in plain language. They acknowledged the unfairness of their actions and the realpolitik of their siege doctrine. The Mongols who lived under Genghis Khan, to a point, didn't live under a deceptive kind of tyrannical rule. Khan's dominance was a known quantity. It expressed itself in black and white. The Bolsheviks, if we want to take an example from modernity itself, but under a different regime, when the Bolsheviks seized power, yes, there's an element of deception in how they got to that point, but they were comparatively transparent about how they intended to do business and why they were doing it, comparatively. So the expression of the tyrannical spirit experienced by all of history, save for our modern democratic period, has been stark, clear, and eminently understandable. Not until the beginning of modern political thought with Niccolo Machiavelli in the early 16th century did human beings have to contemplate a form of tyranny that was self-consciously deceptive. If you accept Tocqueville's argument, as I do, that the tyrannical spirit remains present in our human politics long after the age of tyrants has passed, then how do we cope with its presence in democratic ages? How do we combat oppression when its spirit is forced into the shadows by the edifice of our magnificent and seemingly incorruptible modern political creation? How, why, and where does tyranny express itself when we have a separation of powers, a court system, a House of Representatives, a Senate, and an executive branch, which is ostensibly diluted so that power isn't concentrated in the hands of any one tyrant? So if you look at the reading now, you'll see there's only 5 paragraphs there. And about where I've got to is through the introduction. So I've given you a general overview of where we're going. But let me just sketch out these 4 ideas which correspond to the 4 paragraphs which follow the first one. Okay? Firstly, in this second paragraph, we have an exposition of how Tocqueville sees the nature of man in democratic eras. Now, this is what comes first. When you're doing any kind of philosophy, you need to have an origin point for the ideas. And those ideas are going to cycle around and be influenced by one another. But the origin point that he chooses here is just, as he sees it, the nature of man at this time. Okay, so that's the first idea. The second idea is, what will the nature of government be in this modern democratic era? Okay, and he seems to be saying that government itself is going to be a response to the nature of man. Okay, so this idea is now in the world. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. Equality, democracy, these things have come into the world. And in turn, they produce a particular type of government, or they produce a desire for government. So that's what's happening in the third paragraph, is we have this description of the nature of government. Okay, now I say the nature of government, not saying the structure of government, saying the nature of government. What are its instincts as an organism? The third paragraph's a little tricky. Sorry, the next paragraph is a little tricky. The fourth one down the page. That has to do with the nature of free will in democracy. And this introduces a bit of a contradiction in Tocqueville's thought. And then the fourth one is where the rubber really hits the road for you. Okay, again, as a young Australian interested in tackling the problem of government, which is what you're tasked with doing. Ultimately, that's what you're kind of working towards here. Okay? The last paragraph says, how is government going to affect the individual? Okay, so this government has been established, or this species of government is now being unleashed upon the world. And we call it republican, or we call it monarchical, constitutional monarchy, or constitutional republicanism, whatever it is. It's power to the people that produces this kind of modern government, the modern state, with all its trimmings and trappings, okay? And he seems to be saying, I don't know if you've had a chance to glance at the language, it's not very pretty. He seems to be very, very dark on what's going to become of government in this new era. Okay, so do we have those basic ideas wrapped up? Nature of man, nature of government, free will, and then finally, the effect of government on man. And this is where I'm getting to the question, that's why I use the word soul. How does government affect the individual in modernity? Okay, so here's the first one. So this is the second full paragraph we're going to try and tackle. What is the nature of man and society in democratic centuries? In the second full paragraph of the excerpt, Tocqueville presents a number of ideas about the future nature of democratic man. Most of these ideas relate to the concept of human degradation and alienation. Where others may have looked out and seen democracy as a cause for great optimism, perhaps a chance at technological advancement and a more even spread of commerce and industry, Tocqueville seems to believe that actually this growing condition of equality might instead actually dull us. He thinks it'll make us worse human beings. Or he seems to be saying that we might suffer from it. Furthermore, he seems to think that it's going to separate us. But rather than bringing people together, equality is actually going to kind of draw us apart. First, he says that in the pursuit of equality, we are fated to become, this is a quote, small and vulgar individuals. Tocqueville believes that when we embrace the great levelling of human fates promised by democracy, that we risk losing the great human products of the aristocratic age. Now, for all its inequality, aristocracy gave us adventure, heroism, honour, and virtue. But when everyone is all of a sudden induced to be equal, then, matter-of-factly, equality is what you get. We're less likely to see the kind of unequal distribution of destinies that allows true greatness to emerge. Edmund Burke, the spiritual godfather of conservatism, wrote in 1793, this is upon the death of Marie Antoinette, the age of chivalry is gone. that of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever. This is a civilizational problem. When we have no aristocracy, we have no Alexander the Great. We have no Caesar. We have no Napoleon. I would put it to you, we have no Churchill. Churchill was democratically elected, but everyone would agree his type belongs to the late age of European aristocracy. So no aristocracy. Maybe we have a problem in cultivating human greatness. At least that's what he seems to be saying. It's clear that Tocqueville believes an obsessive pursuit of equality will dull us as individuals. But more than just being individually dull, he sees a future where this levelling produces whole societies that are less ambitious and less meaningful. Under aristocracy, you may have exercised less personal choice, but you were drawn into community life that gave you definition and articulated your purpose back to you. Possessed of that definition, you were ironically more free to contribute to whatever the shared purpose of the community or culture was. Under democracy, when you give people more equality, yes, you free them. And by the way, we should like freedom, okay? We should want to free people. But you also give them the agency and ability to opt out of a native culture or a native way of life. Your particular village, city, state, or country might have insisted upon that way of life for centuries. It could be argued in some cases millennia if you want to survey all of Western civilization as a whole. Now, when all of a sudden that obligation is broken, the consequences for the family, the town, the village, the city, the state, and then eventually the nation, and eventually all of civilization are possibly catastrophic. He seems to think so, at least. What I think Tocqueville predicts is that under prolonged democratic conditions, when each man is made master of his own destiny, it becomes easier for him to slip out of active participation as a citizen of any given polity. And without the active participation of citizens, villages, cities, states, and civilizations simply die. Now, this is a very important point. Importantly, he's writing in between what we would call the first and second industrial revolutions. So technology has got to be on his mind. He's seen its impact. And the signs of the second wave of the industrial revolution are starting to make themselves apparent. Okay? But he doesn't blame technology. That's amazing. Doesn't mention technology. Now, the reason that I think this is such a fascinating insight is because blaming technology itself is the easiest thing that we can. I can't count the number of conservative conferences I've been to in DC where we say, if only we didn't have TikTok, if only we didn't have Facebook, the kids would be fine. Now, of course, I kind of agree with those statements, right? There's something to it. There's no doubt that technology has accelerated things. But isn't it fascinating to see somebody who would have been absolutely critically aware of technology and he doesn't blame technology? So, as Tocqueville encourages, I would encourage you to always look more deeply, certainly more deeply than technology itself, for the generative cause of our modern civic disintegration. I would also put it to you that one of the things you must grapple with most deeply as a young person interested in the health of our nation is how to get Australians to feel an obligation to our country when modernity itself allows and encourages us to escape this obligation whenever we want. Okay? So, that's what happens to the individual. And in turn, maybe the society. So we're not really talking about government yet, we're talking about man and man in society. So let's put things in order a little bit. That kind of man and that kind of society creates what kind of government? That's the question that Tocqueville is asking us. So what is it about Tocqueville that gives him utter clairvoyance in describing the modern nanny and welfare states in fine detail, more than a century before they would explode into our lives, courtesy of characters like Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, Gough Whitlam, Barack Obama, and maybe we'll throw Kevin Rudd in there as well? I think it's because where other modern thinkers sought to outwit the Middle Ages and to quarrel with antiquity, that's what the moderns did. They quarreled with antiquity. Tocqueville had the humility to search for truth more deeply. He himself was a Catholic, but in practice had drifted from the church. That may or may not influence your view of how you read Tocqueville. It probably shouldn't, but that's an interesting thing to contemplate. Tocqueville eschewed the need to propose grand new systems or to impress readers with the brilliance of his own political imagination. Where his predecessor intellectuals in revolutionary France had become conceited enough to fit man to their own designs, Tocqueville seems to have accepted the basic immutability of the human condition. He reasoned that the wisdom of the past revealed a picture of mankind that would never lose its very human interdependency. From this vantage point, he's able to see that when the ethic of mutual obligation, which defined the aristocratic age, was extinguished, human beings would still need support, instruction, and protection as a basic precondition of their existence. This would drive an appetite amongst citizens themselves for a new kind of power to take the place of the monarchs of old. Tocqueville also saw that the fall of absolute monarchy would bring not emancipation from tyrannical oppression, but rather, and this is the important thing, the transfer of oppression from the body corporeal of the old world's kings into the body politic of the new world's central governments. We know that the comfort and agency that one human being can find in another is truly remarkable. No galaxy of bureaucrats and supercomputers could ever best the capacity of a monarch to protect his courtiers and generals, for those officers to meet the needs of their soldiers, those soldiers to meet the needs of their wives, those wives in turn to care for their children, and those children to make friends with one another. That whole web then intermingles in an infinitely complex web of symbiotic relationships. Technology can't replace that. Government cannot replace that, but it's trying to. The world Tocqueville saw us leaving was one where both primary needs like personal security and the delivery of essential services, along with secondary needs like cultural development and leisure activity, were simply just incidental to the pursuit of these interdependent relationships. People certainly had a lack of freedom that we as moderns might find repellent, and probably should find repellent, but they had a resultant degree of closeness, an obligation that gave society an internal safety and stability. Most importantly, it made the mechanism of government itself profoundly less intrusive, if not strictly by law, then certainly in function. Government in aristocratic ages, though in form had to be absolute, in practice had to leave the business of everyday life to local citizens, because no governor can afford to meddle too busily in the affairs of his people, lest they lose the interdependency that held the citizenry of the old world together. Now, Tocqueville and others have rightly described this kind of society as being vertical. That is, it's hierarchical. Every man, woman, and child has their place. It's very difficult to escape that place. Society is much more immovable, and we're offended by this in modernity. And again, I'm a modern, so I'm a little bit offended by the idea that I can't choose my own destiny. But this is how things were. But vertical social organization also reinforces mutual obligation. It tells you that you have someone above you and someone below you. And Tocqueville, in another part of the book, describes this as this unbroken chain of obligations that drops from top to bottom and feeds from bottom to top. Okay? Now, we should rightly love and cherish the fact that in our modern democratic era, we have this thing called equality. We have personal freedoms. We need to defend those personal freedoms. But as a policymaker, and more than just a policymaker, as somebody who should have a philosophy of how to be in political life, you need to be cognizant of the things that we've lost. That's an important part of your political makeup. When the form of government breaks things that have been existent in all of history. Okay, so when government itself, when the way we live tears apart the traditional family. Okay, when it encourages a personal emancipation that scatters us. And maybe a great thing that we could get into if we had more time would be the difference between the nuclear family, which conservatives have been championing for the last 100 years, and the traditional family, which is actually quite different and is much closer to the aristocratic model. Okay, so even something like that, the difference between a traditional family, which with multiple generations under one roof, much closer cooperation between cousins, between different generations, and the nuclear family, which you can say mum, dad, and the kids can pack up, move across the other side of the country, and just be fine. That's actually a very different thing that we're not really used to as human beings. But that's probably a discussion for another time. But that's maybe one example. Okay. Now, when that happens, there's a gaping hole in our ecosystem as human beings, and government moves into it. That's the tragedy that we're trying to overcome. So, the immense tutelary power that Tocqueville speaks of brilliantly captures the spirit of government in democratic modernity. I do not need to add here or to explicate the brilliance of Tocqueville's own language, but I might ask you these questions. Do you agree with his predictions? Does government today seek to watch over your fate? Does it reach beyond reasonable boundaries into your everyday lives? Does it want you to remain entertained, lest you concern yourself too much with what really matters to you and your kin? Does it regulate both your private estate and your private industry? And what of the two most chilling prophecies Tocqueville offers us? Does modern democratic government seek to take away the trouble of thinking and the pain of living? Well, in the pandemic, what did the 40th Prime Minister of New Zealand say? You don't need to think. The government will be your sole source of truth. That's what Jacinda Ardern said. And what about the one that's probably even worse? The pain of living. 2 years after Jacinda Ardern says the government can think for you, Justin Trudeau's government starts offering people free euthanasia instead of caring for their disabilities. Tocqueville is prophetic. He sees this coming. He knows that the government is central governments are going to develop in this way under these conditions. And not only that, I think he knows that people are going to cheer it on. Should chill us. Okay? So, then we have a brief exposition of free will. Okay, I'm not going to labor on this too long because I want to get to the real meat so I can give you some ideas on how we can apply this to policy itself. What Tocqueville has to say about free will might be confusing if not properly understood. He claims that under democracy, the exercise of free will be less useful and more rare. But isn't that incongruous with the state of affairs outlined in the preceding paragraph? Are we not now, with democracy, in an era where a comparative excess of free will has led to the aforementioned state of social degradation? Does man not now exercise more free will than ever before? Now, it's true that on one level, the claim of diminished free will exposes a practical tension in Tocqueville's thought. But what I think he really points us to in this passage is a deeper truth. those of us who've become habituated to a growing smorgasbord of life choices will in turn become less capable of discerning what we really want. We'll be more inclined to simply follow the herd. Free will, in other words, becomes ostensibly more abundant, but less useful and less reliable. I'd say this further. The new species of unlimited government encourages the individual to trust that what is good for him is known less by the guidance of any divine power residing within his own heart, and more by the worldly power that he can see immediately outside himself. Okay? So, then we get to, as I said, what I think is the most important thing. The final paragraph describes, again, in clinical detail, the modern administrative state. And you know what I mean when I say the administrative state. Does that term make sense to everybody? Okay? So the government that, and all its extended appendages, that does everything for everybody. Have a read of the last paragraph before we go on. So it's pretty dark stuff, isn't it? I think it's pretty accurate stuff. Very, very accurate. And again, my education particularly at St. John's College in Annapolis, where I studied as a Ramsay scholar, really encouraged me to choose words carefully. And so when I put the term soul into the title, that was done very deliberately. And when I say soul, I mean the individual stripped of all extraneous detail. So I don't care what clothes you wear or what hobbies you have, but your fundamental beingness, as Martin Heidegger might say. Who actually are you? Okay? And the argument that I make, and the argument that I think emerges from Tocqueville, is that the regime under which you live, in other words, the government under which you live, does inform who you are. Now, I don't like that. Some people might quibble with how that argument is formulated, but the ancients talked about regimes all the time. They knew that a particular type of government would basically create a particular type of people. Now, in the beginning of the passage, Tocqueville's saying, here's the kind of man we have, here's the kind of government that he demands. And by the end, he's saying, when we have this kind of government, this is what it does to people. Okay? And that's why I say this is the real crux of the problem. And this is where you can jump from philosophy into policy, because it's your task to know when to intervene. And you can't do that until you're truly well informed about who we are, what is our nature, and how does government affect us. Okay? That's the real problem that you have to kind of tackle. Now, let's just restrict this to English-speaking countries. Every country has its own set of problems, like I had mentioned early. Okay? Maybe one of the problems that we have as Australians is our founding myth. Or Americans would maybe say our lack of a founding myth. I think we have a very honourable, very noble founding. The story of the First Fleet coming all the way in treacherous conditions, the desperation, the unlikeliness that you could actually found a country, as the gentlemen were mentioning earlier, with basically British ideals here on the other side of the world, and it actually worked. But it's not the same heroic myth that Americans enjoy, that makes it easier for them to push back against government encroachment. It doesn't scream independence the way Americans can rest on that. Okay, Britain, which has the legacy of a particular type of constitution and a particular, inherited hereditary rule, that has its own kind of impotency in dealing with things. Ireland, as I mentioned, has its own problems. America has huge problems, but huge strengths, which have led to this current moment. So you need to be aware of what the strengths and limitations are within your own particular country, even though the general way that Western government affects us is kind of the same. And that's why, even though this book is Democracy in America, I would say it could be democracy in New World English-speaking countries, okay, which is kind of Canada and us, as well as America. Okay, you can apply the general lessons. In a democracy, particularly in a republican democracy, it is the people who are held as sovereign and from whose consent all political power must be derived. The spirit of such government was aptly captured by the framers of the US Constitution, ratified in 1788, who placed popular sovereignty as the origin point of their supreme law. They prefaced their document with, "We the people," for that reason. When Sir Robert Menzies described democracy as a spirit in his Forgotten People broadcasts, he clearly imagined monarchically governed Australians as similarly entitled to these privileges, if not strictly legally, at least in spirit. Popular sovereignty belongs to Australians as well. But the new sovereign that Tocqueville speaks of, the one that, as I'm quoting again, extends its arms over society as a whole and enforces small, complicated, painstaking uniform rules, that sovereign should be understood as the popular power abstracted into an administrative state that has become disconnected from the people it was supposed to serve. This is an apt description of most central governments in the world today. Organizations that have become far too big to stay meaningfully connected to the needs of their true masters, us. Again, I don't need to add to the prophetic description of the cluttered legislative and administrative landscape that Tocqueville paints in this passage. Like all Westerners, Australians today labour under the widespread conceit, and it is a conceit, that the solution to every problem lies in a legislator's bill, or far worse, in an edict from one of the 1,334 government entities listed on the Australian Government Organisations registers. These bodies make law. It's not really in the design of democracy for administrative agencies to be making law, but in effect they do. Though we all suffer this conceit, Tocqueville reminds us that it is, as he says, the most original minds and the most vigorous souls from whom the most is robbed under this regime. You are the anomaly in this room. You managed to escape. In all the activity of the government, in all the ways that it reaches into the education system, you manage to survive. That might be because you have a good family. It might be because you had some circumstance in your life that gave you a pathway through that mess. But you are the anomaly. But I'd ask you to search a little further. Consider why Tocqueville uses a series of tragic expressions to describe the administrative state he sees emerging. He says, I quote, "It hinders, compromises, enervates, extinguishes, and dazes." Most troublingly, he claims that modern government will eventually prevent things from being born. What if we were to take two policy areas typically of concern to modern governments, and what if, before even worrying about specific outcomes, I ask again the general question that Tocqueville inspires. What are we preventing from being born? What soul, whether an individual soul or we could say the soul of the nation, what is the effect of government on the soul of the country? Let's take education. We arrive in the mid-21st century with irrefutable evidence that as government spending, and by the way, spending is a byword for involvement. Government spending on education has increased, quality has decreased. But before we consider subject outcomes or teaching strategies, ought we first ask, What fundamental qualities are our young people not even developing, owing to the smothering influence of government at all levels of our education system? This is a question of soul that asks for something deeper than a statistical answer. We ought to ask, who will our young people be? Before we ask, what will our young people do? Business and taxation. Let's put them together in one category. Any historical analysis of taxation policy will show that less punitive financial regimes are more conducive to small, medium, and large business growth. So we have a prima facie case that a smaller government hand in all business activity is good for business in general. But then we have the pandemic, which shows us that complex non-financial, so non-taxation, government intervention in business is actually pretty survivable by big business. Not small business, it's pretty survivable by big business. In fact, government intervention often makes it easier for big business to thrive, just by its nature, before you even get to particulars. Again, I ask, is there not a moral question that precedes the economic one? Why should we care about the dynamic between government and business if salaries are rising, unemployment is low, and GDP is increasing? Besides the national resilience found in commercial diversity, we ought to care because self-employment is better for the soul. It's also better for society than the alternative. It's better for the soul because it naturally exercises the innate and enterprising qualities that we have. It generates culture, it generates wealth, it generates welfare, but it does it organically. And it does it through an easier set of interpersonal relationships similar to the ones that Tocqueville is lamenting that we're losing. Okay? How do you overcome what Thomas Hobbes described as a leviathan, or that Tocqueville paints as this all-smothering and inevitably all-smothering beast that is government in the democratic age? The first thing is the people have to love self-rule. And again, I love my country. I will never have another one. But we have a problem in this country with a love of self-rule. Not one that is catastrophic, not one that can't be overcome with bright young people that know what to do, but we have a problem. Compared to America, we have a problem. We do not love self-rule the way that Americans love self-rule. And that's why political conditions in America are where they are, and why maybe we're not quite there yet. So we have to love self-rule. Secondly, I'll leave you with this. If we don't quite have that love of self-rule, then it's up to you as people who have an ambition to be master of the laws of the country, to influence the politicians, to become the politicians, to have an informed idea of how to stimulate that love of self-rule. Okay? So if we just stand back and allow and shrug our shoulders and say, yeah, well, we're all Aussies, mate. We're just laid back. Too bad. We're not getting Trump. Okay, maybe the ship will be righted, but you can take it upon yourself to think of ways, whether it be through policy, through advocacy, in the media or otherwise, that you can actually act as a catalyst against what Tocqueville says is an inevitable force.